Some photographs capture love, others capture history. And then there are photographs that should never exist. In a forgotten attic in rural Kentucky, behind decades of dust and silence, lies a wedding album that no one dares to display. The bride smiles, her lace gown glowing against the sepia backdrop. The groom stands beside her, confident, his hand resting on her waist. They look like any young couple of the 1920s, full of promise, ready to start a life together. But the truth inside this picture is enough to curdle your blood. She didn't just marry into the family, she married her own brother. This wasn't a desperate choice, nor a mistake of ignorance. It was tradition, a calculated multi-generation experiment that began decades before either of them was born. An experiment that turned an entire bloodline into prisoners of their own DNA. Tonight we open the doors to the Bramwell family's darkest secrets. Secrets that history tried to erase, but the hills of Kentucky have never forgotten. Before we dive into this chilling legacy, tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. While you're here, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more untold histories, and share it with someone who loves deep, unsettling stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The first time the photograph came to light, it was purely by accident. A local history enthusiast was combing through a condemned farmhouse in Pike County, Kentucky, looking for old mining ledgers and family Bibles, anything that might shed light on the region's past. What he found instead was a small, leather-bound album wedged behind a warped chest of drawers in the attic. The cover was cracked and brittle. The gold leaf lettering faded beyond recognition. Inside, the images were surprisingly well preserved, as if time itself had been reluctant to touch them. One picture in particular seemed at first glance utterly ordinary. A bride in delicate white lace, her smile tinged with nervous excitement. A groom in a dark suit, his arm draped over her waist with possessive familiarity. The sepia tones gave it a warmth, the kind that often makes vintage photographs feel comforting. But the more the man stared at it, the more something gnawed at him. An unshakable sense that the image wasn't telling the full story. What unraveled from that single photograph was nothing short of grotesque. The bride was Sarah Mae Bramwell, and the groom standing beside her was her brother, Thomas. The picture wasn't a secret memento passed between them. It was their official wedding portrait taken in the spring of 1921. For nearly a century, this image had sat in the dark, preserved like an insect in amber, shielding from public view a story that the surrounding community had either ignored or buried. At first, the historian thought perhaps it was a cruel misunderstanding. Maybe they just looked alike. Maybe brother was a figure of speech. But within hours of digging through county records, cross-referencing birth and marriage certificates, the truth emerged in stark black and white. Same parents, same household, same childhood. This was not an accident of affection or an act of defiance against societal norms. This was deliberate. In the context of the Bramwell family, such a union wasn't shocking. It was expected. For 4 generations, the Bramwells had been practicing a form of self-imposed genetic imprisonment, marrying brother to sister, cousin to cousin, under the guise of preserving family purity. Their secluded property deep in the Kentucky hills had served as both a fortress and a cage, keeping prying eyes out while keeping their own bloodline contained within. Outsiders rarely visited, and those who did often left unsettled by the uncanny resemblances between family members, the same pale blue eyes, the same narrow faces, the same quiet, watchful demeanor. To the Bramwells, this sameness was proof of strength, of heritage, untainted by the weakness of outside blood. To the rest of the world, it was the telltale sign of a family eroding from within. The photograph itself became almost symbolic. Less a record of love and more a document of the family's descent into genetic ruin. The details, once you know the truth, take on a chilling quality. The way Thomas's hand grips Sarah Mae's waist, not with tenderness, but with possession. the forced brightness in her eyes as though she understood the role she was expected to play. The absence of anyone else in the frame, no smiling relatives or playful flower girls, just the two of them captured in the stillness of that moment, carrying forward a tradition that had already claimed the health and lives of countless Bramwell children. In the weeks after the historian's discovery, whispers began to circulate in the county. Some dismissed the story as rural gossip, the kind of morbid curiosity that city folk like to invent about mountain families. Others, however, remembered the old tales, murmurs from grandparents about that family up in the holler who kept to themselves and never seemed to marry outside their own walls. But what made the photograph truly haunting wasn't just who was in it, it was what it represented. It was the final tangible proof of a 74-year-long chain of deliberate choices that valued an idea over the well-being of flesh and blood children. It was the moment where the Bramwell ideology reached its peak, where a human life, Sarah May, was reduced to a cog in a breeding experiment designed to satisfy a belief system twisted enough to masquerade as tradition. You could almost imagine the voices of generations past, whispering from the shadows, urging her forward down that aisle, reminding her that this was her duty, her purpose, her destiny. The photograph does not scream. It does not plead. It sits there, quiet and unassuming, daring you to look closer, daring you to confront the truth that some of history's darkest horrors don't come from sudden acts of violence, but from the slow, deliberate choices repeated over decades until they feel inevitable. Long before Sarah May and Thomas Bramwell ever stood before a preacher, their fate had been sealed by a man they would never meet. Jeremiah Bramwell arrived in Pike County, Kentucky in the spring of 1847 with little more than a mule, a wagon of personal belongings, and a past he refused to speak of. To the few neighbors who spotted him along the winding mountain roads, he was just another newcomer seeking a fresh start. But Jeremiah hadn't come to Kentucky for land, opportunity, or the promise of coal money. He had come to disappear. Back in Virginia, whispers had already begun to swirl. Ugly, unshakable rumors about Jeremiah's unnatural closeness to his younger sister, Rebecca. There were no formal charges, no trials, just quiet conversations in church pews and behind closed doors. But eventually, those whispers reached the ears of people with influence. And one evening, Jeremiah was encouraged to leave town. Whether he was driven by fear of scandal or a desire to be free from scrutiny, he left without argument, heading toward the Appalachian Mountains, where questions were fewer and strangers were seldom welcome. The isolation of Pike County proved to be exactly what Jeremiah needed. The hollers were deep, the nearest town was a day's ride away, and the people valued privacy above all else. Here, a man could reinvent himself without interference. But Jeremiah didn't just reinvent his reputation. He began to reshape his family's future according to a vision that most would have found abhorrent. He spoke in rare moments of openness about the dangers of outside blood, claiming it diluted family strength and weakened the character of future generations. To him, the answer was simple: keep the bloodline concentrated. Marry only within the family. Pass on not just the land and the name, but the very essence of the family's being, unspoiled by outsiders who wouldn't understand. Whether he truly believed this or simply used it to justify his desires for Rebecca, no one could say. But in Jeremiah's mind, he was safeguarding something precious, when in truth, he was planting the seeds of ruin. It didn't take long for Jeremiah to set his plan into motion. A few months after settling into a crude log cabin, he sent a letter back to Virginia summoning Rebecca to join him. 6 months later, she arrived alone, pregnant, and with the unmistakable air of someone who had been living under a heavy shadow. Whatever doubts or fears she might have had, they were erased from public view when Jeremiah arranged for a local preacher to marry them. No one asked about their shared last name, their similar features, or the timing of her pregnancy. A quiet payment ensured the church records listed her as Rebecca Matthews, and in the privacy of their cabin, she resumed being what she had always been, Jeremiah's sister, now his wife. The birth of their first child, Ezekiel, should have been a moment of joy. But even as an infant, signs of trouble emerged. A withered arm, delayed speech, a distant, vacant stare. For most parents, this would have been a cause for concern. For Jeremiah, it was simply the beginning of his grand experiment. In the years that followed, Jeremiah's beliefs hardened into doctrine. He spoke of purity as though it were a divine command, framing his choices in the language of God's will and family destiny. The few neighbors who interacted with him learned quickly to avoid the subject of his marriage, and those who pressed too far found themselves quietly frozen out of contact. By keeping his circle small, Jeremiah ensured there were few witnesses to the reality of life inside the Bramwell home. Rebecca bore him several more children, some outwardly healthy, others marked by physical or cognitive impairments that were never spoken of beyond the cabin walls. Each birth was another turn of the wheel in Jeremiah's self-made cycle. Each child a piece of what he saw as an ongoing work toward genetic perfection. He never considered that the defects appearing in his children might be connected to his choices, at least not in any way that would shake his convictions. To him, the flaws were unfortunate, but they were acceptable sacrifices for a higher goal. By the time Jeremiah died in the late 1860s, his legacy was already entrenched. Ezekiel, his eldest, had grown into a man who accepted without question the principles his father had drilled into him. The daughters knew from a young age that their futures were bound to their brothers or cousins, that love would never be part of the equation. What Jeremiah left behind was more than just land, a cabin, and a surname. It was a belief system, a private law, unwritten but absolute, that would govern the family for decades to come. He had succeeded in doing what he set out to do. He had removed the Bramwells from the influence of outsiders, shielded them from scrutiny, and created an environment where his vision could flourish unchecked. But in doing so, he had also locked them into a genetic prison, one that would grow smaller, darker, and more suffocating with each generation, until the day it finally consumed them. By the 1870s, the Bramwell name carried a strange sort of weight in the remote hollers of eastern Kentucky. It was not a name spoken often in town, nor one invited easily into conversation. People knew of them the same way one knows of a shadow at the edge of their property, seen only from the corner of the eye, never approached directly. Jeremiah's children had grown into adults, and under his eldest son, Ezekiel's quiet but unyielding leadership, the family's unusual customs solidified into an unspoken code. No outsiders were to marry in. Every union would be arranged within the family. Sometimes between first cousins, sometimes between brother and sister. This was not merely preference. It was doctrine passed down in the form of stories, parables, and whispered warnings about the dangers of mingling with other blood. Ezekiel framed it as protection. Outsiders could not be trusted. Their morals were weak, their traditions foreign. To the Bramwells, the holler was a sanctuary and the bloodline its sacred treasure. The doctrine was never written, yet it was enforced with the weight of law. At family gatherings, the elders spoke of purity with the solemnity of Scripture. Children grew up hearing that to marry beyond the family was to invite sickness of the spirit, to dilute the strength that God Himself had supposedly placed in the Bramwell veins. Any child who questioned this was met with the same story. How Jeremiah had saved the family from the corruption of outsiders by moving into the mountains. How the bloodline had thrived because it remained whole. There was no mention of the children who struggled to walk or who spoke in broken syllables or who died before they could be named. Their graves dotted the hillside above the Bramwell home, unmarked except for simple wooden crosses. They were not seen as tragedies, but as unfortunate outcomes, sacrifices for the greater good. Isolation deepened the belief. The Bramwells' land lay tucked between steep ridges and dense forests, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that washed out in heavy rain. This natural barrier wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a filter keeping unwanted visitors away. When outsiders did come, occasional peddlers, census takers, or circuit preachers, they were treated politely but coldly, as though their very presence posed a threat. Stories spread about the eerie quiet of the place, the way family members seemed to watch strangers from the edges of the woods, their pale eyes fixed and unblinking. These outsiders often left with a vague discomfort they couldn't explain. Some said it was the way everyone in the household seemed to share the same face. Others said it was the silence that followed them as they walked back down the road, the distinct feeling of being observed long after they were out of sight. Within the family, the doctrine was reinforced not just through words, but through control. Young girls were kept close to home, taught domestic skills, and warned of dangers beyond the property. Boys were instructed in hunting, farming, and maintaining the land, skills that kept them rooted in the holler. Courtship was not a matter of romance, but of arrangement with elders deciding which pairings would strengthen the bloodline. It was a closed loop, generation after generation, reinforcing the same cycle. Over time, the reasoning behind the rules faded. The rules simply were. By the time Ezekiel married his own younger sister, Charity, in the early 1870s, there was no scandal in the holler. To those outside, it might have been unthinkable. To the Bramwells, it was the most natural thing in the world. And yet, beneath the rigid structure of the doctrine, the cost was beginning to show. The number of healthy children dwindled. Birth defects, stillbirths, and chronic illnesses became more common with each passing generation, though no one dared speak of them as consequences. Instead, they were framed as God's tests or unfortunate bad luck. The family clung tighter to the very practice that was undoing them, convinced that straying from it would mean the end of everything. In truth, it already was the end, just a slower, quieter one. The doctrine of blood, once Jeremiah's personal creed, had become the family's cage. And like all cages, it didn't just keep others out. It kept the Bramwells in, closing off every escape until the only path left was deeper into the shadows they had built for themselves. By the time Ezekiel Bramwell reached adulthood, the path before him had already been set in stone. His life, like every Bramwell before and after, was not his own to shape. It had been decided when he was still a boy that he would marry his younger sister, Charity. There were no whispered courtships, no shy glances exchanged across rooms. From the moment they could understand language, they had been told plainly and without ceremony that they belonged to each other. Not because of love or compatibility or even choice, but because of the doctrine that their father Jeremiah had left behind. Charity accepted this as a fact of life, much the way she accepted that the sun would rise over the ridges in the morning and set behind them at night. For Ezekiel, the arrangement carried the weight of duty, something to endure for the good of the family, not to question. Their wedding, held in the early 1870s, was a modest affair attended only by immediate family and a handful of close neighbors who had long since learned to avoid asking difficult questions. In the dimly lit main room of the family home, with its low-beamed ceiling and wood smoke curling in the corners, they stood before a preacher who didn't linger on introductions. There were no musicians, no feast, no exuberant celebrations, just the bare minimum needed to make the union official. Charity's dress was simple, sewn by her own hands from fabric bought 2 years earlier. Ezekiel wore a suit that had belonged to Jeremiah, its cuffs worn thin from decades of use. The vows were spoken in low, steady voices, their words more about fulfilling an obligation than making a promise of devotion. Outside, a cold wind swept down the holler, rattling the bare branches, as if to remind them that some unions are forged in necessity, not warmth. It wasn't long before the first signs of the family's worsening legacy emerged. Charity became pregnant almost immediately, and the household buzzed with a quiet, guarded anticipation. But when the time came, the birth was more a harbinger than a celebration. Not one child, but 3 triplets arrived within hours of each other, and their conditions were a grim reflection of the genetic toll the Bramwells had been exacting on themselves for decades. Samuel, the firstborn, appeared healthy at first, but never gained the ability to stand or walk. His legs were twisted and useless, forcing him to crawl across the floor like an animal. Ruth II was born with her heart on the wrong side of her chest, a rare defect that stole her life before she reached her 5th birthday. And then there was Morai, the 3rd child, whose sharp, almost unnatural intelligence would shape the next chapter of the family's story in ways no one could have foreseen. In those early years, Charity bore the brunt of caring for Samuel and Ruth, her days consumed by tending to their needs while Ezekiel worked the land. Morai, meanwhile, set himself apart from his siblings almost immediately. He spoke in full sentences by the age of 2, could read by 3, and had begun making sense of numbers with an ease that baffled even his father. While other children played, Morai observed, he studied the way the seasons shifted, the way animals moved before a storm, the way his family carried themselves in silence. And as he grew, it became clear that he wasn't just absorbing knowledge. He was developing theories, ideas about the family's purity that took his grandfather Jeremiah's crude ideology and dressed it in the language of science. He saw the deaths of his siblings not as tragedies, but as necessary losses in pursuit of a greater design. For Ezekiel, Morai's brilliance was both a source of pride and quiet unease. It was one thing to uphold the family doctrine because it was tradition. It was another to hear it articulated as a calculated breeding strategy, spoken with the calm certainty of someone convinced they were improving humanity. In Morai's mind, the Bramwell line was not failing. It was evolving. And while Ezekiel never fully understood the extent of his son's ambition, he recognized that Morai would one day take the reins of the family with a vision that was even more relentless, even more uncompromising than his own. The union of duty between Ezekiel and Charity had not brought the family closer to salvation. It had given birth to the architect of their darkest days to come. By the time Morai Bramwell was a teenager, it was clear to everyone in the holler that he was unlike any Bramwell before him. Where others accepted the family's traditions without question, Morai dissected them, cataloged them, and rebuilt them into something far more structured and far more dangerous. He had inherited his grandfather Jeremiah's belief in bloodline purity, but not his vague, almost superstitious justifications. Instead, Morai clothed the same ideas in the trappings of reason and record-keeping. He spoke in calm, deliberate tones, quoting biblical passages one moment and referencing his own hand-drawn charts the next. To those within the family, it gave him an air of authority. To an outsider, it would have been the language of obsession disguised as intellect. But there were no outsiders in Morai's world, only subjects in his ongoing experiment. Morai's notebooks became his prized possessions, each filled with precise details about every Bramwell birth, marriage, and death. He charted eye color, height, mental capacity, and any physical abnormalities he could observe. Stillbirths were recorded alongside the living with notes on suspected causes. He measured skull shapes, tracked the age at which each child began walking, and noted who exhibited what he called special traits, exceptional memory, heightened senses, or unusual problem-solving abilities. He believed these traits were proof that the family's methods were working, that the impurities of the outside world had been kept at bay long enough for something extraordinary to emerge, that most of these so-called gifted children also suffered from debilitating conditions didn't factor into his conclusions. To Morai, the cost was irrelevant if the result was progress. His reign as patriarch began in the 1890s, when Ezekiel's health began to fail. Morai's marriage to his sister, Temperance, was arranged without a whisper of dissent, and together they produced 7 children in just over a decade. 3 died before their first birthdays. 2 survived but were so severely impaired they required constant care until their deaths. This left only Thomas and Sarah May, children Morai regarded not as beloved offspring, but as the apex of his selective breeding program. He raised them with meticulous attention, monitoring their diets, education, and health as if they were prize specimens. From birth, they were told they belonged to each other, that their pairing was not just tradition, but destiny. He watched them grow, not as a father filled with warmth, but as a scientist waiting to see if his most carefully crafted experiment would succeed. Outside the Bramwell home, the world was shifting. The turn of the century brought railroads, telegraphs, and the creeping influence of modern medicine into rural Kentucky. But Morai kept the family insulated from these changes, fearing that outside contact would disrupt his work. He rejected doctors unless they could be bribed into silence, refused to send the children to school beyond what was necessary for basic literacy, and guarded the family's land with a possessiveness that bordered on paranoia. Neighbors learned to keep their distance, both out of respect for the Bramwells' fierce privacy and out of a growing discomfort with the family's strange sameness. By now, the physical resemblance between its members was uncanny. Identical eye shapes, matching bone structures, and an almost eerie uniformity in mannerisms. What outsiders saw as unsettling, Morai saw as a badge of honor. In his mind, the Bramwells were on the verge of achieving something monumental. He believed that through his strict control of breeding, he could produce a generation with heightened abilities, free from what he saw as the moral decay of the outside world. He spoke of genetic transcendence as if it were within reach, convinced that his children's children would surpass ordinary human limitations. But what Morai refused to acknowledge was that the toll had already been exacted. For every child who could recall a book's page after a single reading, 10 more were buried in the family plot. For every unusual gift, there was an unspoken lifetime of suffering. The Bramwells had stopped evolving long ago. They were unraveling, and Morai was too deep in his own vision to see that he was the one pulling at the threads. From the moment Thomas Bramwell drew his first breath in 1896, his life was never his own. His father, Morai, saw him not as a son to be nurtured, but as a cornerstone in a grand, multi-generational design. When Sarah May was born 2 years later, she was instantly bound to Thomas in a way neither of them could escape. They were raised under the same roof, taught the same family lore, and reminded at every turn that their destinies were already entwined. Childhood for them was not a time of discovery or freedom. It was an extended preparation for the roles they had been assigned before they could even speak. Other children might dream of futures shaped by choice. Thomas and Sarah May were told theirs was a sacred duty to marry one another, to continue the line, to serve the vision their father had devoted his life to. Their upbringing was a study in control. Morai regulated every aspect of their lives with a precision that bordered on obsession. Meals were carefully portioned with diets designed to optimize their health. Education was conducted at home, heavily slanted toward the lessons Morai valued. Basic literacy and arithmetic, yes, but also the family's history presented as a noble saga of resilience and divine purpose. They learned that outsiders could not be trusted, that the world beyond their land was a place of moral decay and physical weakness. Visitors were rare, and when they did come, Thomas and Sarah May were kept at a distance, their interactions supervised and limited. This isolation wasn't simply about keeping them physically apart from the world. It was about shaping their minds so completely that they could not imagine any life outside the one Morai prescribed. As they grew into adolescence, the nature of their relationship shifted, not in affection but in expectation. Morai never spoke of the coming marriage as a possibility. He spoke of it as an inevitability, something as certain as the turning of the seasons. Thomas, tall and broad-shouldered, was groomed to see himself as the protector and executor of the family's legacy. Sarah May, with her delicate features and striking eyes, was molded into the role of the ideal bride, poised, compliant, and entirely devoted to the cause. while other young people in nearby towns were meeting potential suitors at church socials or barn dances. Thomas and Sarah May's only courtship was a lifetime of shared meals, shared chores, and the unspoken understanding that they were being prepared for each other. There was no romance, no thrill of the unknown, only the steady march toward a predetermined future. If either of them harbored doubts, they were buried deep beneath years of conditioning. Thomas accepted his role with a stoicism that seemed almost inherited, his emotional responses muted by a lifetime of being told what to feel, when to feel it, and how to act. Sarah May, on the other hand, learned to mask her emotions behind a quiet, almost ethereal demeanor. On the rare occasions when she questioned their path, when she asked why they couldn't meet others, why they couldn't live in the wider world, Marai would respond with parables about weaker families who had collapsed after allowing outsiders in. These cautionary tales were always followed by a reminder. She and Thomas were special, chosen, the culmination of generations of sacrifice. It was a message designed to smother rebellion with a sense of divine importance. By the time they reached their early 20s, the arrangement felt less like an impending choice and more like the closing of a trap. In the spring of 1921, Thomas was 25 and Sarah May was 23. They had never known a world where their lives could take a different turn. The wedding date was set, the preparations handled entirely within the family. To the outside world, if the outside world had even been invited, it might have looked like the beginning of a love story. But within the Bramwell household, it was simply the next step in an experiment that had been running for nearly 80 years. Neither Thomas nor Sarah May was walking toward the altar as free individuals. They were walking toward it as carefully bred specimens, fulfilling the destiny that had been crafted for them long before they had the words to question it. The spring of 1921 brought an early warmth to the mountains of eastern Kentucky, the kind that melted snow from the ridge lines and coaxed wildflowers from the damp earth. In most homes, this season would have meant open windows, laughter drifting out to the yard, and preparations for planting. But in the Bramwell house, all attention was fixed on a single event, the wedding of Thomas and Sarah May. There were no invitations printed, no neighbors called upon to witness the occasion. The guest list was as tight as the family's grip on its secrets, a handful of relatives all sharing the same narrow faces and pale eyes, and the local preacher who had long ago learned that some ceremonies came with generous payment and very few questions. The isolation was deliberate. This was not a day to be shared. It was a ritual to be contained, guarded from the scrutiny of anyone who might see it for what it truly was. On the morning of the wedding, Sarah May prepared in the same small bedroom where she had spent her entire life. Her cousins helped braid her hair, their whispers filled with excitement, as if this was no different from any other wedding they had seen. The dress she wore was a relic. Her grandmother Temperance's gown altered to fit her smaller frame. Its white lace had yellowed with age, but Morai insisted it carried the weight of tradition, linking Sarah May to every Bramwell bride before her. She carried a bouquet of mountain laurel picked from the same hillside where those brides had once gathered flowers. To an outsider, these details might have seemed romantic, steeped in family history. But here, history was less a source of pride and more a chain, one that had been tightening around Sarah May's neck since birth. Thomas waited in the main room, standing before a makeshift altar positioned beneath the faded portrait of Jeremiah Bramwell. He wore his father's suit, the seams stretched to fit his frame, his expression unreadable. There was no hint of joy, no trace of nervous anticipation, only the steady stillness of a man fulfilling an obligation around him. The air was heavy with wood smoke and the faint scent of drying herbs. The preacher, his eyes carefully averted from the family resemblance in the room, began the ceremony without flourish. His voice was low and deliberate, each word falling into the silence, like a stone into still water. He never acknowledged the obvious, the shared blood of bride and groom. He simply moved through the familiar phrases until the vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the papers signed. When the ceremony ended, there was no music, no laughter spilling into the yard. The guests, most of them blood relatives, offered stiff congratulations, their voices muted as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile normality they were trying to project. The family gathered for a single photograph, the bride and groom standing side by side, Morai positioned proudly between them. In the photo, his expression carries the quiet triumph of a man who believes he has brought his life's work to its pinnacle. But for Sarah May, the moment was less a celebration and more a confirmation of what she had always feared. There was no way out. The marriage had been sealed, and with it the next chapter of the Bramwell experiment was set in motion. Outside, the mountains stood indifferent. The breeze moved through the budding trees, the same as it had for generations, carrying with it no knowledge of what had just occurred inside that dim, smoke-scented room. The world beyond the holler remained unaware that another union of brother and sister had been sanctioned, that another turn of the genetic wheel had been set in motion. Inside, Thomas and Sarah May began their life as husband and wife, not with the hope of building something new, but with the weight of maintaining something old, something so deeply ingrained that it had come to feel inevitable. To those who stood in that room, it was simply the way things were, and the way they had always been. But history would remember it differently, not as a wedding, but as the day a century-old curse was renewed. The first child came the following winter in the biting cold of January 1922. Snow piled high against the walls of the Bramwell home, muffling the outside world in silence. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Not the nervous excitement most families feel before a birth, but a sharp, watchful tension. Morai treated the pregnancy like a scientific trial, monitoring Sarah May's every symptom, recording her cravings, and even her dreams in meticulous detail. He believed this child would be the crowning achievement of his decades-long breeding program, the most genetically pure Bramwell ever born. But when the baby arrived, a boy named Josiah, the room fell into a heavy, stunned quiet. His spine was exposed, a severe case of spina bifida. His skull was misshapen, his eyes clouded with cataracts, and his breathing was shallow and labored. No one said it aloud, but the reality was undeniable. Josiah would not live to see his first spring. He survived only 6 weeks. Each day, a slow, painful march toward an inevitable end. His short life, a silent indictment of the ideology that had created him. Sarah May, still weak from childbirth, rarely left Josiah's side. She sat beside the crude wooden crib, singing lullabies to a child who could not hear her, holding tiny hands that could not grasp back. She had been raised to see motherhood as her sacred purpose, the ultimate contribution she could make to the family's future. But now, watching her firstborn suffer, something deep within her began to shift. She started to question what she had been told all her life, that purity was strength, that their way was God's way, that sacrifice was noble. These thoughts came quietly at first, whispered doubts that she buried beneath her duties. But the seed had been planted, and with each breath her son struggled to take, it grew. Thomas did not share her doubts. When Josiah died, he spoke of the loss with a cold detachment that chilled Sarah May to her core. To him, Josiah was not a child whose life had been stolen by the family's choices. He was data, information, an unfortunate but valuable result in the ongoing experiment. "We'll try again," Thomas said plainly, as if they were discussing the planting of crops after a poor harvest. And so they did. The second child came later that year, living only 3 days before his small body gave out. The third survived for 2 months, his short life marked by seizures that grew more violent until they finally stopped his heart. The fourth was stillborn. Each loss carved deeper lines into Sarah May's face. Her grief pressed down under the weight of a family that saw these tragedies not as failures, but as steps towards some imagined perfection. By 1924, Sarah May had given birth 4 times and buried every one of her children. Her body was weakened, but her spirit, once compliant, almost fragile, was hardening. She could no longer reconcile the suffering she had witnessed with the stories she had been told since girlhood. The Bramwell doctrine, she realized, was not a tradition born of love or divine will. It was a curse, a deliberate, calculated cycle of pain dressed up as honor. She began to resist in small ways at first, declining to follow Morai's dietary instructions, refusing to let him take notes on her private thoughts, and avoiding his probing questions about her next pregnancy. These acts of defiance went unnoticed at first, dismissed as exhaustion. But inside, Sarah May was already deciding that she would not bring another child into this world just to watch them die. The Holler remained silent on the matter, either ignorant of the specifics or unwilling to confront them. Life outside the Bramwell home went on as usual. Neighbors tended their fields, children played in the muddy spring thaw, but inside the Bramwell household, Sarah May's quiet rebellion was taking root. She had not yet spoken her decision aloud, but she carried it like a hidden ember, ready to burn away the path that had been laid before her. The family might still believe the experiment was ongoing, but for Sarah May, it was already over. And in the years to come, her choice would mark the beginning of the end for a bloodline that had spent nearly a century destroying itself from within. The winter of 1925 settled over Pike County like a heavy shroud, the kind that seemed to trap the cold inside your bones. Snow drifted high against the Bramwell house, sealing it off from the outside world even more completely than usual. Inside, Sarah May sat alone by the wood stove, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea gone lukewarm. For months, she had been quietly defying her husband's expectations, refusing his unspoken demand to try again for another child. She knew what that meant in this house. Children were not seen as blessings, but as the next entries in Morai's breeding records. And after 4 tiny graves, she could not, would not, bring another life into the world to suffer the same fate. The weight of her decision was immense, but so was the clarity it brought. For the first time in her life, Sarah May felt ownership of her body, her choices, and most importantly, her voice. It was a voice she began to use in ways no Bramwell woman ever had. At first, she tested its strength in small conversations with her cousins, hinting that maybe their way wasn't as pure or righteous as they had been told. Most met her words with uncomfortable silence, but a few let their eyes linger on hers a moment too long, their expressions betraying unspoken agreement. The real turning point came when Sarah May began speaking to someone outside the family. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician from the county seat, had been called to treat a sick child from one of the more distant branches of the Bramwell clan. What he saw alarmed him. Physical deformities, developmental delays, and a strange uniform pallor in every face he examined. When Sarah May found herself alone with him, she told him more in a hushed 15-minute conversation than anyone had dared reveal in 80 years. Her confession poured out like water breaking through a dam. She told Dr. Webb about Jeremiah, about the doctrine of blood, about the countless children born only to die in agony. She spoke of Morai's records, of the calculated pairings, and of the way the family called these tragedies necessary sacrifices. Webb listened without interrupting, his expression tightening as the scope of it became clear. He promised her discretion, but also told her plainly. What she had described was not just tragic, it was deliberate, dangerous, and in his eyes unforgivable. Sarah May returned home with her heart pounding. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For the first time, the family's secrets existed outside the Holler. Thomas noticed the change in her. He may not have known about her conversation with the doctor, but he could feel the shift. The way she no longer avoided his gaze, the way her refusals to discuss another child were firm rather than hesitant. To him, this was betrayal. To question the family's ways was to question its very existence. Their arguments grew sharper, colder. He accused her of being selfish, of turning her back on generations of sacrifice. She told him in words she never imagined she'd say that their sacrifice was meaningless, that it had never been about purity, only about control. If Thomas had been capable of love in the way others understood it, perhaps he might have seen her pain and understood. Instead, he retreated into the comfort of Marai's logic, refusing to entertain the idea that they might be wrong. By spring, Sarah knew she could not undo the damage the Bramwells had done to themselves, but she could end her part in it. She stopped attending family gatherings, avoided the spaces where breeding plans were whispered and reinforced, and spent more time on the outskirts of the property, where the hills stretched toward towns that didn't know her name. It was not escape, at least not yet, but it was a step toward it. The breaking point had been reached, and though it would take years for the Bramwell name to collapse entirely, the quiet defiance of one woman had already begun to dismantle the walls from the inside. What had once been a perfect, unbroken circle of tradition now had a crack in it, and no amount of silence could close it again. The collapse of the Bramwell family did not come with a single dramatic act, no fire that consumed their home or violent scandal that forced their name into the newspapers. It came quietly like a slow leak in the walls of a dam, each generation losing just enough strength for the structure to finally give way. In 1926, Thomas was found dead in the barn, his body withered by the very conditions the family had believed they could control. There was no grand funeral, only a small gathering of kin who whispered about his passing as though it were an inconvenience. To the outside world, his death meant nothing. To Sarah May, it was the end of the chain that had bound her since childhood. Yet she did not celebrate. Thomas had been as much a victim as anyone else, molded into his role and stripped of the choice to be anything else. His life was proof that the doctrine had devoured not only the weak, but the strong. 2 years later, Morai followed. He died in the same house he had ruled for decades, clutching the battered leather notebooks in which he had recorded every birth, every death, every anomaly of the Bramwell line. Those records vanished with him, burned, buried, or hidden. No one knew. Their absence left only memory and rumor, but the damage they cataloged was etched into the cemetery stones scattered along the hillside. The same names repeated over and over, marking lives that had flickered briefly before being snuffed out. Without Marai's iron hand to direct the family's future, the Bramwell structure began to unravel. Younger members, already thinned in number by decades of loss, drifted away from the holler, marrying outsiders, abandoning the land. The bloodline could no longer sustain itself, not biologically, not emotionally, not in spirit. Sarah May lived on until 1934, a quiet figure who kept mostly to herself. She never remarried, never bore another child, and never stepped back into the role the family had once demanded of her. Instead, she became a reluctant messenger, sharing her story in fragments to anyone willing to listen. At first, it was just the local doctor or a trusted neighbor, but word traveled. Some dismissed her as a bitter widow. Others, particularly those in isolated communities, heard her warnings as a rare, valuable truth. She spoke not with the venom of revenge, but with the solemn conviction of someone who had watched too much suffering to remain silent. If her words saved even one family from following the same path, it was enough. The property itself fell into decay. By the late 1930s, the Bramwell home was abandoned, its windows broken, the porch sagging under years of neglect. The land, once fiercely guarded, was eventually sold for unpaid taxes. Hunters who wandered too close spoke of a strange stillness that lingered there, as if the air itself carried the memory of what had happened. Inside, the rooms were bare, stripped of furniture and warmth. but some claim to have seen scraps of lace from an old wedding dress hanging in a closet or a rusted cradle in the corner of an upstairs bedroom. Whether these relics were real or imagined hardly mattered. The story of the Bramwells had already taken root in the local imagination, becoming part cautionary tale, part ghost story. Today, the name survives only in faded county records and the occasional genealogical study. To historians and genetic counselors, the Bramwells are more than just a grim curiosity. They are a case study in what happens when ideology outweighs compassion, when control is mistaken for legacy, and when human lives are reduced to entries in a ledger. The family that once prided itself on its unbroken bloodline had in the end destroyed itself from the inside out. And while their story may be buried under layers of dust and time, the lesson remains sharp. The most enduring tragedies are often the ones we build ourselves brick by brick, tradition by tradition, until there is nothing left to hold.